Question Lane is a podcast where the goal is to solve problems through the process of questions and answers. Today's guest is an author and professor of science education at Indiana University. Today's series of questions and answers will be centered around Area 2, Economics, and Area 3, Entertainment, specifically his academic paper, The Snare of Systematic Racism and Other Challenges Confronting Hip-Hop-Based Pedagogy. Our guest, Dr. Jomo Mutegi. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
What would you like to be referred to as? Dr. Mutegi, Jomo, another name maybe?
Jomo is fine.
Perfect. We'll go with Jomo. So for people that might not be familiar with you, would it be accurate to say that you are a black male?
Yes.
So as a black male in America, what motivated you to become a professor in a field where people describe black people as being underrepresented?
Well, the way I came to my current profession is it was not by intention, and it was more out of my lack of knowledge, actually. When I was in college, I studied chemistry, not because I wanted to be a chemist, but because I wanted to get a degree. My goal at that time was to eventually start a school, and I thought if I had a good understanding of business, I could have a business that would financially support the school. But I had difficulty studying business. It was not interesting enough to me to maintain my focus, and so I changed my major to chemistry. And when it came time for me to graduate, I was planning to go to grad school. Again, I had the same vision of starting a school, and at that time I thought that if I earned a terminal degree in some area, that would open doors for me and put me in a better social position for starting the school. So I actually started looking for programs in education, and I found one. I ended up going to Florida State. And that's where I learned about academia, and I learned what research was about. I learned what professors did. My program was actually very strong. My major professor was very strong. Their motto was that you learn to do academic work by engaging in academic work. And so from day one, they had us doing the work that professors did. And over that next 4 years is where I actually fell in love with academia. The pace of life, the life of the mind, where you engage in ideas, and the autonomy that comes with it. That's also where I got I won't say got the idea, but where I began to see how much freedom and flexibility came with that position as a university faculty member, and how you could affect social change from that position or that platform. And so that was really the way I got into my field.
Well, as an FSU alum, I'm glad you had a good time on campus.
Oh, you went to FSU as well?
Yes, sir.
Oh, what year did you graduate?
2012.
Oh, that's all right. My man.
Yeah. Yeah, economics.
Okay,
to quote the late, great Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, words are very, very important. So before I get into your paper, I want to get some definitions. Hip-hop-based pedagogy, what is that, and who developed this concept?
Unfortunately, I can't tell you who developed it because I haven't looked into that history of it. I can tell you who some of the pioneers are at the time at which I came into it. I would say Emery Petrower, Chris Emden, David Stovall. When I first became aware of hip-hop-based pedagogy, those are some of the leading proponents and authors writing in that area. And I'm sorry, I missed the first. I don't remember the first part of your question.
The first part is just a brief, brief definition of what it is.
Yeah, what it is. So basically, hip-hop-based pedagogy is an effort to get teachers, K-12 teachers primarily, but also university teachers to some degree. The effort is to get them to use hip-hop in their instruction. And the argument is that urban youth, and this they use the terms interchangeably. Urban youth, sometimes it's marginalized youth, African American youth, hip hop youth, but this group of young people is already interested in hip hop. They're attuned to hip hop, and they come from what the proponents call hip hop culture. And so, if you can bring that cultural perspective into the classroom, you can better engage them in learning academic subject matter. That's the basic argument and approach used by hip-hop-based pedagogy advocates.
So, briefly, to be clear, it's a way of teaching and relating to, I guess, urban youth to make them understand how to grasp some of the concepts that's taught in classrooms?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a little story about a hip hop class if we have time after reviewing a paper that you might find interesting.
Okay.
So another word, racism, that's included in your title of your paper. When you use the word racism, what do you mean?
Well, when I use the word racism, I'm referring to the systemic and systematic mistreatment by whites of non-white people. And I give that as a definition. That's the best definition I can give that I've thought about. I have a sense that we could even, to some degree, probably remove race from the equation. And I'm stepping out on a limb here a bit, but this may make sense. If we take blacks off the planet, white behavior will still be what it is. And so when we look at their behavior historically towards each other, it's pretty much just as bad. So I think that although we understand racism largely in a black, non-black dynamic or a black-white dynamic, you know, the misogyny, the rape, the torture, the monopolizing of resources, if you take us away, they'll still do that. And so to some degree, we have to understand racism as the inherent behavior that whites have exhibited throughout history.
So it sounds like a solution might be to have different groups of people in control of, the 9 major areas of people activity, not necessarily focusing on race itself. Would that be accurate?
I would not say that. I agree with the first part, but yes, there does need to be different people in control of the 9 areas of people activity. But I wouldn't say that race is not a factor. And the reason I wouldn't say that is not because I can explain it. I can't explain it, but history is very clear in the racial demarcation. And so I have a friend who we often have this discussion. You know, he's of the mindset that the history we live in is just accidental, just kind of worked out that way. But my argument is a bit different. There have been non-white people who have had the ability to dominate their known parts of the world, but they haven't done it in nearly the way that whites have done it. And we see that consistently. We see it with the overthrow or the destruction of the Native Americans here. We see it with the destruction of Native people in Australia. We see it with their destruction of much of the economy and agricultural systems that existed in India around the time of the spice trade. And so other groups of people have had military power, technological power, but they've still been able to coexist with other folks and to not degrade the planet. We have not seen that restraint ability in whites. And so I don't know why we see that, but I do know that that is consistent in my understanding of history.
I'm glad you clarified that because I agree wholeheartedly, for sure. So I'm going to hop right into the paper here. It's rare because I've just recently started doing this podcast maybe about a year ago, and reading some of these academic papers on from a lot of different professors and researchers across different areas, I find it really rare that someone quotes Neely Fuller Jr., especially the way you did at the beginning of your paper. Can you talk about that quote and why did you decide to include it?
Absolutely. So, and I'm just going to go back to read a quote. If you do not understand white supremacy, racism, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. And what I've seen in hip-hop-based pedagogy scholarship is that there's an attempt to appropriate the mantle of race fighters. So sometimes the hip-hop-based pedagogists present themselves as race advocates. That's a better way to say it, race advocates. However, the conceptualization of the problem, the way that we are situated historically in their scholarship and their thinking, and then the behaviors that they advocate all work against this idea that they're advocates, race advocates. And so I wanted to, or I say we, because this is not just my paper alone, but we wanted to foreground this notion of racism, and we wanted to have a clear sense of what we meant by racism. So I think that sometimes people use the term racism as something that they're fighting against, but when you really listen to what they're saying, they're really advocating for a more of a humanist, can we all get along? We are not fighting against any individual people. We're fighting against this larger idea of oppression. And so when we look at how we're situated currently, that's not really what our fight is. Our fight is not really against this amorphous notion of oppression. And that's what Dessalines and Boukman Dutty were fighting against in the Haitian Revolution. You know, I think they called it the Phantom of Liberty. They're not fighting against a ghost. There was real people on our island that are oppressing us. And those are the people that we're fighting against. And so when I look at the educational condition of black children, 80% of the teaching force is comprised of middle-class white females. Well, I got to look at the middle-class white female and say, what are you doing to the black children in your class? I'm not just fighting against this larger invisible force that we might call ignorance. I'm actually trying to address the people who should bear some responsibility for this larger idea of ignorance in our schools.
Man, I could not agree more. A system is comprised of people, and people are the people that's in charge of the system. So someone has to be creating it, maintaining it, and expanding it for sure.
Right.
Before I get into my next question, you referenced a couple of people earlier that I guess are at the forefront of hip-hop pedagogy. What is it called? Pedagogy? Pedagogy. You referenced a couple of people. Were those people white people, or who are those people exactly?
Well, there's a mix. So I think one person I named was Emery Petrower, and he's white. I mentioned David Stovall, Chris Emden. They're both black. I don't remember who else I might have mentioned, but those are three that come readily to mind. So if you look at hip-hop based pedagogists, if you say you get them all in a room, then you're going to see there are significant numbers of blacks in that group, but there are also significant numbers of whites. I'm going on maybe 3-4 years ago, the last time I was at a session where that was hip-hop, where there was a large collection of hip-hop based pedagogy scholars. I would say it was maybe 30 to 40% black, 40% white, and then we also have a large international contingency as well. So people from that might not clearly be distinctly black or white, but of other nationalities and racial groupings.
Okay, thanks for clarifying on that.
Sure.
So the word urban, we talked about that earlier. Urban, what does urban mean, and can you briefly describe what you meant by that when you used it in the paper?
Well, my use of urban in the paper was really a capitulation to how others use urban. It's not my sense that when we use the word urban, we're not saying what we mean to say. And in fact, in the paper, we criticize the use of urban. So by definition, an urban area is a geographic region with a certain population density. You might also add to that it has to have a certain diversity, ethnic diversity or racial diversity, maybe even economic diversity. But really what you find is that urban has become a proxy for black or for non-white. In some areas, like in California, it wouldn't be black as much as it would be, Latino, Asian, just the non-white population. And so one of my criticisms is of this area of work is that they're referring to the population of interest as urban, but they never unpack what that means by urban. And the reality is that we transition these boundaries throughout life, really in a given day. So a child might live in a home that's in a space that can be called urban. Then they might go to school in a space that can be called suburban. They might go to church in a space that can be called suburban or rural. And so in a given day, we transition these boundaries, and certainly throughout life, we transition these boundaries. I would like to see in our scholarship that we were more definitive in identifying clearly the groups that we want to address. So if we're writing about black children, then we should call them black children or African children, or children of African descent, whatever is the most accurate term. The reason for this distinction is that you do face certain circumstances by virtue of living or working or playing in an urban space. And you also face certain circumstances by virtue of being black or of African descent, regardless of the space. So many times black people in urban spaces share the same issues as black people in rural spaces and in suburban spaces. And so by changing the terminology to be more euphemistic, we're actually missing an opportunity to clearly identify the problems and challenges that confront the group of people that are of interest to us.
So would it be accurate to say that when researchers or, I guess, politicians use the word urban, they're kind of codifying what they mean instead of saying black or...
Yes,
okay.
100% most of the time.
So challenge number 2 of the paper, you talked about Edmund and Lee's work, where you wrote that the authors assert that hip-hop culture has been proposed to be a means through which urban youth can find success in school. Did they measure that success and kind of outline what that even means?
No, they did not. That was one of the what we identified as a challenge, which I see as very problematic. And this is not unusual in education spaces. I think the degree to which they did it was probably more extreme. They ignored the measure of success more than most people do. But very often, we assume that if students do well on the test, then we're successful. If students want to go to college, then we're successful. And I'm really pushing, and here in this paper I say, this needs to be unpacked. What are you characterizing as success? So in their paper, the paper that we're critiquing here, Emden and Lee identify students in a classroom setting. I think at one point they wrote that the students would signify their agreement with head nods or with hand movements. And so as I'm reading it, I don't know what to do with that. I'm like, okay, did I do a good job or not? What kind of head nod am I looking for? What kind of hand movement am I looking for? And why do we call that success? Now, so just on the level of doing what we'd call good scholarship, I think that they missed the boat in this area, on this item in particular. But even beyond that, if we step away from it and if we want to be critical about what education should look like for black children, I would say that we have to have some sense of self-determination, some sense of empowerment in order to call anything that we do as Black children a success. If you give me a minute, I want to read a quote to you from Amos Wilson, which captures this idea.
Yeah, please do.
Amos Wilson said, "If our study of Black history is merely an exercise in feeling good about ourselves, then we will die feeling good. We must look at the lessons that history teaches us. We must understand the tremendous value of the study of history for the regaining of power. If our education is not about gaining real power, we are being miseducated and misled. We will die miseducated and misled." And I agree with this wholeheartedly. So if our education is not about gaining power, if you can score a perfect score on the SAT, but you're not in a position to regain power for us as a race of people, we're being miseducated. And so even beyond, the nondescript head nods and head movements, even if they came back to me and said, okay, hip-hop-based pedagogy can have your students scoring higher on a test, I still would say, what good is that for Black children? The way we are positioned socially and in our social historical context right now, we are in a place where the only thing that can help us, or one of the few things that can help save us as a race, is to have a greater degree of power, societal, social power.
Yeah, and I agree with your acquisition of power emphasis because, as a young man, it's kind of tough to find other people that are my age demographic that are doing things constructively, but still have a willingness and a wantingness to help out other Black people. Most Black people that are successful are, they're in academia or they're in the professional space, and they get away from where they grew up and who they knew, and providing other ways of explaining how to reach the status that you have obtained. That's kind of what I'm looking to do with this podcast, is just have people explain different concepts and provide some suggestions that hopefully they can apply to their life.
Okay.
Perfect. So President Obama, he was referenced in this paper. What does President Obama dusting his shoulders off and being mistaken for throwing up the rock have to do with teaching science or other subjects in schools?
Well, Alonzo, that's a tough question.
I don't want that, so I'm just asking.
You're asking me to represent the author's argument of the paper we critiqued, and I don't have an answer for that. I think that to some degree, and I'm just guessing here, but this. When did their paper come out? Give me 1 second to. I don't remember the exact date of their. 2011. Okay, so right. So their paper came out in 2011. So that was right around the time when there was a lot of euphoria around Obama's election. So to some degree, trying to make connections to Obama might have been a strategy for getting the paper published. I mean, even scholars, we do have to market our work, and so we do have to have an audience that we appeal to, and we try to find ways to do that, and that might have been part of what was at play. But in terms of the substance of it, Obama was certainly a good symbol for people of African descent. At the very least, we could look to or point to Obama, and we always have a good feeling when one of our own is doing something well, even if they're not fully one of our own, right? Even if we can just have the feeling that they're one of our own. So that's why we get excited about our entertainers, because they seem to have acquired some degree of wealth and acceptance in the larger white social structure. But beyond that, quite honestly, I can't point to or explain why what it is about Obama that puts him in a position of making science more accessible to Black children, or what's more important to me, putting us in a position of having more liberatory education that's going to help to liberate us. So I don't have a clear answer.
Well, I'm not gonna beat up on Obama too bad, but I'm glad you made the distinction about one of our own. I won't really go into detail about that, but overall, I was just asking because I could understand maybe like a social science class where you're talking about, the first black president and what that means from a sociological standpoint. But when it comes to something that's like a hard science, I can't really envision how dusting your shoulders off or, doing some type of dance would, impact anything like that. It's just something I found that was interesting.
Yeah.
So in challenge number 4, you cite an example of the authors categorizing hip-hop as lowbrow culture. And I wanted to see from your perspective, if hip-hop is at the fringe of Western society, modern Western society, and is considered lowbrow culture, then why is it so important to use this as a method to teach black kids who may need more help than others?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what's tricky is I think what you're tapping into with the question, you're asking the question of me, but I think that's the kind of question that you would want to ask of the authors of the original article, right?
Correct.
And you're challenging one of a contradictory assumption that the authors are operating on. So there's a couple of things I'll say in response to that. And the first, just to give some framing for your listeners, there's a number of assumptions that hip-hop-based pedagogy relies on, or the foundation of their thinking rests on a set of assumptions. I'm going to just share 4, and then I'm going to come back to this one because it's one of those 4. One assumption is assumption of that I call hip-hop and culture. And the assumption is that hip-hop represents the culture of urban youth, or that it's somehow a reflection of African or African-American culture. So that's the culture assumption. And that's the one I think that you're tapping into. But let me just hit on the 3 others real quick. The second assumption is that hip-hop is a source of social commentary. The third assumption is that the violence, the misogyny, the materialism that we see in hip-hop represents only a small or insignificant portion of hip-hop culture. And then the fourth is what we call the assumption of ownership. That is that hip-hop belongs to urban or African-American or minority youth, that group somehow owns hip-hop. So in the article that you're referring to that we wrote, the response, we challenge these assumptions. And we've also done a special issue in which we've challenged these assumptions more explicitly. And each paper addresses one of the assumptions. So going back to the assumption of hip-hop and culture, it doesn't, when you read the writings of hip-hop-based pedagogists, a lot of times when we present an idea, we try to go back to the beginning. And so when they go back to the beginning, they go back to the Bronx in the 1970s. And as a scholar, you think, wow, you want to situate the culture of black people in the Bronx in the 70s. I mean, we really lost some ground. I remember Juwan Kunjufu years ago used to argue against starting our culture with slavery, in the 1500s. 1600s. One of our colleagues, Kemet Shockley, Dr. Shockley, he argues that you can't ignore our African culture in preference of identifying our culture as being something that you want to call hip-hop culture that starts in the 1970s. And so the biggest contention we have is with this assumption is, what is it that positions you to justify this as a culture that belongs to us, when at the same time you can ignore a real African culture that we've had going back really millennium? And then if we want to unpack what comes with that culture, you get into much more dangerous territory. So, I mean, we can see it just out in our neighborhoods. and what hip-hop culture gives you. I think there's one author, McWhorter, who identified the thuggish presentation of yourself, or the anti-intellectual presentation, the non-serious presentation. We see that many times in athletes. I remember Kevin Durant once was quoted saying, "Man, I don't care about all that business stuff. I just want to hoop." Or by contrast, you are a business unto yourself. You are a business that brings in millions of dollars, and for you to say that you don't care about business and you only want to hoop, that represents this anti-intellectual approach that really has not been indicative of us as a race of people. But we only see that if we get back beyond 1970, the Bronx, and we go back to what we were as African people before we were enslaved by whites. So we want to ask ourselves, well, what kind of people were we then? What types of culture did we have? What were some of our ways of interacting? And it's a profoundly beautiful culture that we once had, and that we still have vestiges of, but it's fast dwindling as we begin to embrace a hip-hop culture that is really put on us by another group of people.
You referenced McWhorter. Were you talking about John McWhorter?
Yes, I believe his first name is John.
Okay. So you talked about this, or referenced it earlier, about this whole "can we all get along" concept. So on page 17, you wrote that there's good evidence that millennials, who comprise a significant percentage of hip-hop consumers, manifest the same racially derogatory perspectives as their parents and grandparents before them. When you wrote that, were you talking about white millennials or just millennials in general?
Yeah, I think the reference was really to non-black millennials.
Got you. I figured. Because all of my associates or former associates or co-workers that's in my age range, they like hip-hop too, but they tend to listen to Future or 21 Savage, but scoff at rappers like Kendrick Lamar or Big Crit. Have you had like a similar experience in your life with these type of rappers being like super favorites of white people?
Well, to be honest, my interaction with whites doesn't really, it's not such that it lets me know what kind of music they like in modern times. If you want to ask me about whites that I interacted with in the 80s and 90s, I can be a lot more informative. But I don't really know what they listen to. I don't ask. It never comes up in conversation. But when I look at statistics, I do see that they are a major purchasing group of hip-hop. When I look at the Billboard Top 100, it's very clear that it's not just us, because you see hip-hop crossing genres. When I go to the movies, if I'm at a store, I really can't shop in public without in some way being exposed to some degree of hip-hop. So all of these factors communicate to me that whites somewhere either like it or are not bothered by it, that they allow it into spaces that they control.
Well, maybe it's just me, because I like to ask questions. That's just my personality. Yeah, constantly observing. And this, you might not be familiar with this concept either, but I wanted to throw this out to you to see if you had any commentary about this. On YouTube, there's this big surgence of what people classify as reaction channels. So that might be people reacting to 90s hip hop or maybe contemporary hip hop, but it's just this explosion of white people and their kids, or however else they describe it, reaction with mom or reaction with dad, etc. Have you seen this type of emergence of people like consuming hip hop, or are you unfamiliar with that?
Well, I'm not familiar with the reaction channels. Is that the way that you can see how people are responding to it? Is that can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, to be I guess more clear, like if you go to YouTube right now and you type in, let's say, Tupac All Eyes on Me. There'll be like a bunch of videos that pop up, and it'll be like someone in the title saying, Mom listens to Tupac or whatever. And then you will click on the video, and then there's like white people listening to the music and breaking down the lyrics and confusing what some of these things mean and things of that nature.
Okay. And so state your question again.
I guess the question is, if these people are reacting to hip-hop, do you think that that is going to be a way where they possibly stop practicing racism, at least on a small scale, or do you think that they'll still practice racism even if they are exposed to our quote-unquote culture?
Okay, so I really appreciate that question. No, they're not going to stop practicing racism. In fact, they're going to practice it more. There's a speaker who runs an organization in D.C. The organization is Positive Kinetic Vision, and the speaker is Kush, the Black Unifier. And he does a lecture series. It's called Terrorism from the Entertainment Industry. And he addressed this very issue in one of his lectures. He said sometimes we look at whites listening to hip-hop and being okay with it or liking it, and we think that somehow they're going to become less racist. He said, but why would they become less racist? All they do by listening to hip-hop is get reinforced of the same racist ideas that they've always had. So if you already think that blacks are lazy, if you already think that blacks are less intelligent, if you already think that blacks are criminal, and you listen to, you know, Tupac or I don't know who the latest rapper today is. I know Lil Wayne might not be current, but, you know, some of the Lil Wayne or the trap rappers, there's nothing you're going to hear that's going to contradict the mindset that you bring to listening to the music. Everything you hear is going to reinforce that mindset that you bring to the music. And so he asked the question, why wouldn't they listen to it? It reinforces their thinking. He said they'd probably go out and buy two just to keep the movement going, you know? And so there's nothing in it that would lead me to think that would stave off racism. There's no, if we want to take a psychological approach, there's nothing in it that will cause you any cognitive dissonance where you've got to, you know, you have a way of thinking, you have this new experience that challenges your way of thinking, and now you're in a point of dissonance at which you've got to stop, recalibrate, and alter your thinking. There's nothing in hip-hop that will have a racist alter their thinking. So what hip-hop actually serves to do is it reinforces in the minds of the world's population who black people are and how they should be treated. It's one of the worst propaganda tools that we have working against us as a race of people. And what disheartens me to some degree is the way that we, with a religious fervor, support it. We're really supporting our own destruction.
That's a harsh reality right there, for sure. Harsh reality. You wrote about middle school students, and you wrote that hip-hop leads to an overvaluation of material possessions and the ability to entertain, and it undervalues intellectual behavior, which you spoke about when you referenced Kevin Durant. So when we see viral videos, whether it be on the internet or on the news, with teachers dancing the latest hip-hop dance in their classroom, does that promote learning, or does that promote just being an entertainment committee or a court gesture?
Yeah, that's a good that's a really good question, and I would agree with the latter most likely. You know, I don't want to assume that whenever there's dancing it's a problem, because there is a place and a time for dancing, but I mean, for everything, you know, for dancing, for laughing, for humor and that sort of thing. But again, all things have to be put in context. Now, that quote that you read was actually us summarizing a study that was done. This was an ethnographic study done at a middle school in Baltimore, and I think the researcher was in that cultural space for about a year, 6 months to a year. And so after 6 months to a year of of spending time in a school across a wide range of different types of school activities and people within the school, one of the definitive conclusions that the author came away with was what you just read, that there's an overvaluing of material possessions, and he was able to, in his data sources, link it directly to the consumption of hip-hop in the students, and to some degree in the teachers, and then also an undervaluing of intellectual behavior. Now, I want to juxtapose this against something, and maybe you and maybe the listeners might want to close your eyes. It's getting harder and harder to do this kind of thought exercise because the way society is changing. So I would say to just imagine back to you being a young child and having an interaction with your father or your mother where they're trying to teach you something. Now, see, some of our fathers and mothers are not as mature, so we might have to go back to a grandfather or a grandmother, right? But try to imagine your parents or your grandparents trying to teach you something that was important, and then superimpose that image of them dancing for you or dancing with you. You probably can't reconcile it. They probably don't even go together. And that's because I use the father and mother because that's somebody who loves you, who wants what's best for you, and they require something of you. And so I was listening to a teacher who was doing a TED Talk on hip-hop-based pedagogy. And he told a story of a time when he was in school. Teacher told the whole class to be still, stand still, don't move. And he said, I just felt like I was being oppressed, and I went to move, and the teacher punished me, and I felt like I wasn't valued. And I thought, man, your takeaway is all wrong. As a father, I've done that with my own son. You know, stand still, don't move, stand like a soldier. It's not going to kill you. I'm teaching you self-discipline, right? And so if I'm trying to teach you self-discipline, that's not a space for what we used to call tomfoolery. You know, you're not going to sing, you're not going to dance, you're not going to giggle. In fact, my son now, sometimes when I'm trying to explain something to him, he's sitting there giggling. I say, man, stop giggling. Wipe the smile off your face. I want to see a serious posture. And so when we love somebody, we hold them to high standards. And what I see many times in the videos that you're describing, or what I've seen in videos that fit what you're describing, there's the white gentleman that has a charter school, I think somewhere up in New York, and he was on the cafeteria table dancing with the students and that sort of thing. Okay, that all looks well and good, but I'm also thinking, well, to what degree are the students also being taught to be serious-minded and proud and productive young people who will become proud and productive adults for our community? So I guess it's a lengthy answer just to say that I'm not going to totally say it's always inappropriate, but it's really hard for me to reconcile our job as adults preparing students to be serious-minded adults one day with, you know, me coming to be an entertainer for you or having you become an entertainer for others.
I agree, because from our perspective, I would be asking questions about their GPA, their test scores, how many scholarships they've accumulated. Are they going to college? Are they going to trade school or military? I would be asking those type of things because, like you said, it's not an absolute situation where dancing or introducing hip-hop is a necessarily bad thing, but it's just the seriousness of this is education. We're here to learn, you know, and I believe that, you know, we should have that at the forefront. So based on your research and our discussion today, would you suggest that hip-hop be used as a tool to teach black youth?
Well, again, I'm going to say it depends. So what's happening now with hip-hop-based pedagogy is you have a lot of people, black and non-black, many of whom don't have a clear understanding of racism and a clear commitment to fighting against racism. And they're pushing and advocating hip-hop-based pedagogy. And so remember I described to you the predominant teacher in K-12 education is a middle-class white female. Now, am I going to, as a responsible scholar, go to middle-class white female and give her Tupac and say, here, use this with your black kids, everything will be all right? I'm not going to do that. That's irresponsible of me. And so if there's a degree of scaffolding, if there's a degree of purposefulness with how it should be used in a responsible way, I have no issue with that. I don't see that scaffolding. I don't see that intentional packaging of the pedagogical approach as it's being presented to our current practitioners. Now, I have in one of the papers that we had in our special issue was actually by a teacher. The teacher was an African-American woman who, I think she has about she had 4 or 5 children at the time. In fact, she was pregnant when she was writing the paper, so it's probably 4 or 5. I think she has 6 now. And she had the task of creating a math lesson, one that was a traditional lesson and one that was a hip-hop-based pedagogy lesson. I guided her in identifying the research, identifying the researchers. She couldn't find any sense of direction as to where to go for implementing this as a method of instruction. I helped her to contact researchers who did work in this area and teachers who did work in this area. She found got little response or support. And so she did the best she could with the paper she found and pulled something together. And she implemented both versions and assessed the effectiveness of both versions of the lesson. And at the end of it, her reflection was, as a black woman who has a husband who listens to hip-hop and who has black children, and with the support of a professor trying to help me to navigate this, I was totally lost in trying to implement hip-hop-based pedagogy lessons. What that tells me is that the 80% of middle-class white females who are teaching have no hope of taking what's being given to them from hip-hop-based pedagogy and implementing it, if this teacher couldn't do it with support. The other thing I'll mention in this line is that I have done a project. It's not published yet, but we did develop a test lesson. I was working with a researcher in North Carolina, and a researcher and a teacher in North Carolina implementing it, but it was a very different take. So one of the purposes of the lesson that we presented was to help students see hip-hop as a tool of propaganda. And this was also a math lesson, and the students were presented with data drawn from a real study in which they had to manipulate mathematically the data and then draw conclusions and make inferences. What could the data tell you? And the anecdotal reports from that teacher who implemented it were that the students got really good insight, they were highly engaged, and it caused them to think differently about their consumption of hip-hop. And we never said don't listen to hip-hop. We just said that if you listen to it, be aware of what's happening to you psychologically. Be aware of how it might shape your behavior. Here's what data tells us. What does this data mean to you? And so that's what I mean by when I say a scaffolded approach and a more intentional approach to using it in instruction.
Yeah, and to be clear, I still listen to it, no doubt. I'm young, so I guess that's, what I grew up on. But I know how to compartmentalize that,
right.
At least to the best of my ability, I do. I think I do. So what are some suggestions that you have for, kids that are in school now, K through 12, or young adults that are in college to help them be more constructive in increasing their math skills, graduation ability, and research and development and into different topics? What can you suggest that they tools that they could use in order to become more successful and from academic perspective?
Okay. Yeah, so the first thing I would say is, that I would offer as encouragement, is to immerse. I think it's important for young people, for all people really, but you see, young people have such a tremendous advantage. They have the advantage of time that older people don't have. And so when I say time, I mean it in 2 ways. Number one, if assuming that we all going to live to be 70, the 10-year-old has 60 years of time. The 50-year-old has only 20 years of time. So the 10-year-old has more time. That's time in one sense. But the other way that the 10-year-old has time is they've got 24 hours a day. They sleep 8, maybe 6 is monopolized by school. All the rest of the time is theirs. The 50-year-old got to work, got to take care of kids, got to pay bills, has to take care of the house. So even in a day, the 50-year-old doesn't have the same time that the 10-year-old has. So what I would say to the 10-year-old or the 15-year-old or the 18-year-old is to immerse yourself in things that are of interest to you, but in developing your mind around those things. It's a time you have where you can immerse yourself and become expert in almost anything that you really will come at a cost much later in life. So, and I'm not prescriptive. If the student is interested in science, that's great. If the student is interested in basketball, that's great too. Whatever your interest is, follow that interest, but immerse yourself immerse your mind in a study of that thing. Become expert in it. And so, as a race of people, we have a tremendous advantage, a tremendous potential advantage at our disposal right now. Most times I think we look at life and we see all the stuff we don't have as a race. And I tend to sometimes look and say, okay, I get what we don't have. Now, what do we have? I'm going to share this with you. I teach at the college level. Most of my students are white. And one thing I'm starting to realize, and that I've seen in scholarship that I've been reading on technology, students don't read anymore. They're becoming averse to reading. The attention spans are shrinking. There's an author who wrote What the Internet is Doing to Our Brain. His last name is Carr. I don't remember his first name. It's either David or Nicholas. I don't remember right offhand. But he unpacks a number of studies that are pointing to how young people, or people in general, are being conditioned by the technology such that it's very difficult for us to be patient, to sit down at a problem for an extended period of time, to sit down at a book for an extended period of time. And then he also identifies what is lost when that ability is lost. Okay, so that's where we are. Here's an advantage that we have as a race of people. We don't have to lose that, because what causes us to lose it is completely voluntary. We can commit ourselves to reading. We can commit ourselves to protracted study of a given problem, or try to figure out a given machine, a building project that might take 3-4 months. Just commit to doing it. Take it 3 or 4 months. And what comes out of it is a much deeper insight, much deeper understanding, and a different disposition, a different way of being than you would get if you follow the conventional way of gathering information and interacting with the world. And so when I say immerse yourself in a study, immerse your mind in a study of something that's of interest to you, that's one vehicle for immersing yourself in a study. If I really want to learn a lot about motor cars, I can watch a lot of YouTube videos, or I can read 2 or 3 books on cars. I could, work with somebody who in my family has access to a car and they let me tinker on it. And I might spend hours, I might spend days, weeks tinkering on that car. You'll get so much more from that slow approach than you will from looking at the YouTube videos. I'm sharing with you what research is telling us. And so it's one thing to, I'm not a big, go to school so you can go to college so you can get a good job. I'm not big on that. We all should be gainfully employed. We need money. We got to eat. But I don't think that we're going to college our way to liberation as a race of people. And so if we're doing things that bring us joy, and if we become good at it, that's one idea that I'm drawing a blank on his name. But the author wrote a book, So Good They Can't Ignore You. And he says that you don't become successful by finding something you love. You find something you love when you become successful. And so the guy that loves basketball probably is really good at it. And that's why he loves it, because he's really good at it. And so whatever the thing is, once we begin to immerse ourselves in it, once we begin to study it and become expert in it, we're going to be good at it, and that's going to distinguish us. And that carries so much more weight and power than the college degree will carry.
And that book you was referring to, that's Cal Newport.
Newport, thank you. Thank you, brother.
And I attest to what you're saying because, at 28, and I'm the first person in my family to graduate from college, and I tell my siblings and just people that I grew up with back at home that college is not as hard as you think it is. I graduated in 3 years, and to be honest, and this is just honest, I really didn't read a lot of books in college. I just read over the chapter that I needed to review, or went over the couple lessons or formulas I had to get prepared for, whatever test I had to pass, and that was pretty much it. I would say probably within the last year and a half, I've read more books and academic papers than I did my entire life.
Right, right.
My entire life. So that I could definitely attest to what you said, and it definitely is true, and we need to focus on reading for sure.
And if you don't mind me asking, the books that you've read now, what prompted or what was your impetus for reading them, whereas in college you didn't?
Well, for me, I'm on an entrepreneurial kick right now, so I had to learn different things, and after speaking with different people that gave me advice on how to handle my business, they wouldn't just say, "Hey, watch this YouTube video." These are older people, so they would say, "Read this book or read this academic paper," and with my area of focus, I have to read these type of things. It's not a lot of videos on these type of things on the internet, so I was kind of forced to read. And as I read more and more books, I started venturing out into African American studies, that type of thing, and that's where my interests kind of developed. But overall, I would say reading is definitely a competitive advantage for sure.
Okay. So, and it sounds like what drove you to it was an interest. You had an inherent interest and a need to some degree, and so that's what was your initial impetus.
Correct.
Yeah.
And just one last thing, I spoke about it earlier. In my senior year in college, I took an elective course. It was, I think it was sociology of hip hop, and you talked about middle-aged white women teaching in school. My professor was a middle-aged white woman, and the TA was a white man. He probably was like 25 or so. And I didn't speak up a lot in the class, but just now reflecting on it after reviewing your paper and having this discussion with you, in the class basically being full of white people, I could understand why they loved Tupac, or I think Future was big at that time too, because those were the type of discussions we had in class. But when we had to give our final paper about what album we were going to select, I selected Death Certificate by Ice Cube. I mean, not Death Certificate, Lethal Interjection by Ice Cube.
Okay.
And so we had to listen to a couple of tracks, and when Khalid Muhammad came up, no one had any questions about that at all.
Right.
None whatsoever. They didn't have any question about the 5% Nation of Islam, which I'm not a part of, but I'm just saying, I find it interesting, like I was saying earlier, how it's like certain rappers and certain imagery is very pushed.
Absolutely.
So do you have any upcoming research or social media that you want to promote before we leave today?
Absolutely. We always have new research coming out. So I don't have anything that I see hip-hop related that should be up right away, but we have had 2 papers come out within the past few months that might be of interest to some of your listeners. One paper actually is a reflection on the U.S. educational system. We call it Windows and Mirrors. So this paper is a collaboration between me and a colleague in Kenya, and it grew out of an international visit where we had colleagues from the U.S. visiting a university in Kenya. And we saw some stark similarities between the 2 educational systems and the way that they are almost structured to be problematic for black people. And so that paper, I mentioned, it's called, I think it's called Lessons from the Jewakali. Oh, no, What the Jewakali Taught Me About Curriculum in the U.S. And then the second paper was published back in November, and it dealt with this issue of microaggressions. And basically, we had a project where there was a summer nanotechnology camp, and at the end of the camp, the evaluation team got together, and we had two parts of the team. So one group did the quantitative evaluation. They just looked at the statistics, and they saw improvements, and they were really excited. Oh, the camp was great. We got improvements on all our scores. Then the other team was the qualitative team. They were ethnographers, and they had interviewed students and observed students. And they said, are you sure everything went up? Because the black students didn't seem to have too good of an experience. And so the first team went back and said, oh, well, we need to look at the results by race. And lo and behold, the black students went down on many scores, and the non-black students went up on many scores. And that masked the fact, it hid the fact that the black students had such a bad experience. So our paper actually unpacks that scenario, and we call it a tale of two camps. So they're in the same space, but they had two very different experiences. And at the end of it, the blacks were much less likely to want to pursue nanotechnology as a career. And the reason I'm excited about this paper is because many times when we get grant money to do a camp or some kind of project, we want to tell the world how good it is, and we don't really look deeply to see, was it really good? And was it really good for everybody? And this paper shows that you can actually have results that look like they're good for everybody, but they're really not. And we make some suggestions as to what people can do to ensure better experiences for black children, better science experiences for black children. So those are the two most recent ones that we have. And if your listeners are interested, they can get them on our website. Our website is www.es2rp.org. es2rp.org.
Thanks for clarifying that, because I would want to read that second paper.
Okay.
Any social media before we go?
I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. You can tell I don't really use them that well because I don't even know what to tell you. What's my handle? I think it's probably at Jomo Mutegi. For sure, if you type in my name,
it'll come up.
Me, so it'll come up, right. I think my Twitter handle is at Jomo Mutegi, and I think my Facebook handle is, it's just es2rp.org or es2rp on Facebook.
Okay. Well, hopefully people won't question you about hip-hop and its effectiveness.
Periodically, when I do some hip-hop stuff, I get some nasty grams, so I'm used to it.
Okay, good. All right. Thanks for talking with me today, and I appreciate the time. And we'll put those links in the description.
Thank you, Alonzo. Thank you for this opportunity, and also thank you for the work you're doing. If anything I can do to support you, let me know. I like your spirit, and I like what you're doing, and I want to see you do well at it.
I appreciate that. We'll definitely be in touch.
Okay, then.
All right. Thank you.